As a German, I sometimes discover American ideas that are barely known, let alone accepted in my country. One such notion is that of a sociopath. Well, everybody has heard the term. Most Germans just associate it with serial killers. Americans take it to mean much more than that. There's more than one book about it. I'll just present my own definition, and I hope it fits whatever you think of it. Sociopaths are defined as people who are not constrained by any conscience, and they never feel guilty. No matter how immoral they behave, they don't feel guilty. And in the wider sense, they generally lack empathy and pity, and are just plain selfish. They're not necessarily stupid or mentally disabled in any other way. In fact, most of them are rather intelligent. Now, that makes sense, given that apparently as much as 1 in 25 is a sociopath. So when that's true, most people really seem quite normal to me. Most of them apparently cover it up, and that requires some brains. It's also indeed not necessarily the lunatic serial killer. Some of them do very well in the economy, and many of them are actually CEOs. That probably also makes sense, I suppose, because after all, they can lay off people without any shred of guilt or shout at them to make them work harder, just for their own personal gain. But there are also those who just live on welfare, or even let their partner work for them, without feeling guilty. And they are intentionally playing on their partner's conscience without feeling bad about it in any way whatsoever. So basically, sociopathy is assholism, in layman's terms. But here's what I don't get. Why is the awareness of this condition so widespread, but the obvious corresponding opposite mental disorder is not even recognized? I'm talking, of course, about ratiopaths. Ratiopaths are people not restrained by any logic, and they never feel any inconsistency in their beliefs, no matter how contradictory. And in the wider sense, they lack the capacity for abstract thought, curiosity, and are just plain retarded. Now, they don't necessarily lack feelings. In fact, most of them talk about little else. Now, that makes sense because have you ever asked yourself, who watches soap operas? In fact, any of this purely emotional crap you usually see on television these days. Very little of that has any appeal to the thinking mind. That in itself should make it very clear how much more dangerous this condition is, because it obviously applies to a majority. And if you're still skeptical, note that they're not all the totally debilitated TV junkies. Some of them do very well in politics, and one is even president. That probably makes sense also, I suppose. After all, they can tax and regulate the economy out of existence without the tiniest shred of awareness that it's going to be their end too. But there are also those who just can't or don't want to get a job in the government, and those you often find in those many activist groups. Like those who want to fight social injustice, or save the environment, or fight the patriarchy. It makes perfect sense. Since their impairment isn't regarding feelings, they will still feel sympathy for the exploited poor, and be worried about the climate change, and outraged about the oppression of women. And their stupidity will allow them to overlook that none of this is real. So ratiopaths are do-gooders, in layman's terms. But I never thought of them from a pathological, genetic perspective until I heard about those sociopaths. But it is strange. What I'm wondering is why any scientist would be concerned about those. After all, a world consisting entirely of sociopaths would be paradise. Think about it. Of course, there might be some crime, muggings and rapes, but they're assholes, not stupid. So those of them who are lazy parasites in our current mixed world would then not find any compassionate victim anymore, so unless they're happy to go to prison, they really are forced to switch to the other category, which is the ones being successful in the economy. And those would probably be really pissed of muggers and rapists and the like. After all, they themselves can buy anything they want, and crime only hurts them. So they would probably support a strong legal system with very strict and consistent laws and severe penalties, a legal system that keeps in check all the other assholes, but it is at the same time acceptable to those, and because they can support it too. Now contrast this to the vision of a world with only ratiopaths. That would be a total nightmare, like the French Revolution or Woodstock. Indeed, there are attempts of explaining history with the pathology of sociopaths. Now, let me try to do this with the pathology of ratiopaths. Hitler came into power through a democratic process. Long before he became chancellor, that guy declared his plan to get complete dictatorial power over Germany without any intention to give it up later, to wage a war of annihilation against Russia for the sake of living space. He wrote a book about it. And eventually his faction got enough votes for him to become chancellor. Did the electorate think he was joking? Did they want to lose all their freedoms and die in a war of annihilation somewhere in Russia? I think a much neater explanation is that they were indeed ratiopaths. They did not lack a conscience like the sociopaths, no, stupid enough to assume that their stakes are with home and fatherland, retarded enough to think of race as something that could define you, and gullible enough to believe that a dictator in lonely power could be willing or even wise enough to do the right thing. Nothing could stop their conscience. On any disagreement with the upcoming Nazi force, it would let them feel guilty. How can anybody think of his own survival as being more important than that of your race? You are nothing, your people are everything. And communism. Think about how you're a hard-working, honest man in Russia before the revolution, and some Bolshevist comes along and tells you that they want to abolish private property, especially the means of production. Now, you might be puzzled at first and inquire what that's supposed to mean. So, he's going to elaborate that private property is an evil instrument of your oppression. They're going to take it all away, but not for their own benefit. No, no. It's going to be the property of the public. The new owners will be the people. And you're not against the people, are you? You don't have an antisocial personality disorder, do you? Because when we get in charge, we have just the right medicine for that kind. Now, if you're a normal guy, like you and me, you'll probably laugh at him and tell him to take a hike. If you're a sociopath, however, you'll punch him in the face and then laugh at him and tell him to take a hike. But if you're a ratiopath, and you really need to have it big time for this one, Nazism isn't quite so obvious because at least nominally you seem to be allowed to keep your belongings for the time being. No, for communism, your feelings, your compassion, your pity, and your desire to do the right thing must not be clouded by any shred of common sense whatsoever. Only then you will become a guilt-ridden, miserable commie apologist. But then you'll give him all the money you have, a blowjob on top of it, and 10 years later you find your life ending in a forced labor camp after not having licked a bureaucrat's ass to his satisfaction, and you'll never know what killed you. But you'll comfort yourself that at least you were a decent man in an unjust world.